Hey everyone, welcome to another Wellness Wednesday. I know it's not noon and I'm late, but this is the way of things these days. No matter how hard I try, I get behind. And to be quite honest, I wasn't ready with the EMF stuff that I wanted. I once again did not have a chance to get my meter out and take some readings, which completely defeats the purpose of showing you the things that I bought to try to reduce or harmonize EMF on my person or in my home. And so there's really no point in talking about it. So I'm sorry. And plus it's almost like a personal battle whether I continue to talk about coronavirus or not. I really don't want to, but with the amount of misinformation out there right now, I feel like I have to. I'm an Enneagram 8. If you don't know what that is, look it up. And you will understand why I have a ingrained inability to ignore the inner voice in me that screams when something is not true or unfair. And my husband will definitely back me up on this, because I actually refuse to play Monopoly with him and his friends anymore because they don't play by the rules and they gang up on me and I'm always the first one out. So I am a huge person about things being fair. And if I have the ability to share some education, to bring some peace of mind to people, to clarify some of the issues that are going on, I feel like that is my duty. I feel duty bound, if you will. I feel like if I don't do it, I am just like fighting this inner battle in myself. So there was one article that I shared a while back. I am not exactly sure where I first saw it, but I felt much better about sharing it after the Children's Health Defense shared the same article, which, if you don't know about the Children's Health Defense, that's the organization that is a nonprofit led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and people mostly associate that with the vaccine movement. But there's actually a reason it's called Children's Health Defense and not Children's Vaccine Defense. They do all kinds of stuff. They're investigating, EMF radiation and 5G and its effects on kids, the chemicals and pesticides in food like glyphosate. They were the team of lawyers that won the first case against Monsanto for causing cancer out in California. Was it the hundreds of millions of dollars was the lawsuit. So they're legit people. And I trust what they say because they don't just put propaganda out there. They're actually actionable. They're doing actionable things to try to make stuff better for the next generation, specifically for kids. So this was an article by J.B. Handley. He's a Children's Health Defense contributing writer. It's called Lockdown Lunacy 2.0, Second Wave, Not Even Close. So I'm not even going to get into the mask thing because I know it is an incredibly heated debate right now. The point is, I want to talk about what's behind that, right? What's driving that, which is the fact that people think there is a second wave, that this is still happening, right? And what I love about this article is he did a really great job of talking about herd immunity. And I know there's going to be some people who right away jump on this and say herd immunity is all hocus pocus. It doesn't exist. It's not real. It's not proven or whatever. Because I have heard that argument. But here's the thing. The numbers in this case, if herd immunity wasn't true, then the scientist or the Nobel Prize, where's his name? Nobel Laureate, Dr. Michael Levitt, wouldn't have been able to predict within a few hundred cases the number of deaths in Sweden. So I wanted to share this, I think, because this is something that's not getting talked about. And if you understand herd immunity and how a virus moves through a population, you would understand that it's not a second wave. What's happening is multifold. This is one of the biggest things, is that it's just continuing its path, right? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to look at a map and say, oh, look, New York was a hot spot, right? moved through the Midwest. Now we're kind of on the downswing. But where are all the new hotspot places, right? Florida, allegedly. Texas, allegedly. I'm hearing from someone I know who works in a hospital in New Mexico that their hospitals are now getting overwhelmed, okay? It's moving through. It's just made its way through. And the intermittent cases where somebody in Arizona flew back to Wisconsin and then they tested positive and infected their family here. So it's jumping around like that, okay? It was always going to. As people move around, we move around in different ways than we used to in 1918 with the Spanish flu that everyone loves to compare this to now. But the reality is, if this was really as deadly as the Spanish flu, we would all be boarded up in our houses right now. I mean, you think this is chaos right now? Imagine if 1 out of 3 people was basically dropping dead on your street, because that's basically what happened with the Spanish flu, actual deaths. So that's kind of the other aspect, I guess, to take into consideration, is that cases don't equal deaths, right? So initially, and the way that JB starts out this article is talking about the fact that, can we all agree that the stated purpose initially to lock everything down was to flatten the curve, right? So do we all understand what that meant? It didn't mean that the virus went away. It meant that by separating ourselves, we slowed the spread so that we didn't overwhelm the hospitals, right? So it didn't eradicate the virus. It didn't kill it. It didn't give it anywhere to go. It just slowed the spread because people weren't coming into contact as much with each other, right? So ergo, less spread, less overwhelming cases in a hospital. Now, right now in Wisconsin, and again, I'm in Wisconsin, so this is what I'm referencing here, what's going on here. I live in a county that now has a mask mandate. We have never had our hospitals overwhelmed, not even in the entire state, not even close. Doctors and nurses are getting laid off, okay? If they were never overwhelmed to begin with, we certainly don't stand a chance of overwhelming them now. And we know this because we look at the numbers. So even if the cases are higher, the hospitalizations continue to decline. The deaths continue to decline, both in Wisconsin and in the entire US, based on the CDC. There's a graph right here in the article. So what that means is if you have a higher number of cases, despite the higher prevalence of testing going on, but less hospitalizations, what that means is that the cases that are happening are either mild or asymptomatic. They're less severe. People who are getting a positive result, which is a whole other argument, right, about the efficacy of the test and false positives and false negatives. Even if we just assume that's legit, the numbers still don't speak to what we're hearing, right? So if you remember on the news, it used to be a death count every day. Now it's a case count. Why? Because the deaths continue to go down. And before, everything was driven by deaths. Now that the deaths are going down, we can't continue to drive the narrative forward with deaths. So what do? We flip it, and now we're driving it forward with cases. However, prior, people had to either be admitted to a hospital or presenting to a medical facility with a specific set of symptoms to warrant testing for coronavirus. So you got to think even then that there was probably a lot more cases out there than what we were seeing in terms of the numbers, because a lot of people weren't even being allowed to be tested. They were going to the hospital and being turned away. Well, I was exposed to someone. Well, do you have symptoms? No. Well, then go home. Come back when you have symptoms. That's what it used to be. Now we have this facility called the Alliant Center here in Madison that's open for free public testing, and people line up in their cars and wait for hours on end. Some people are getting tested every week now. So when you now test anyone and everyone who wants it at any time, of course, a little bit of that is going to be an increase in cases, right? But then you also have to understand that that was going on all along. It just wasn't being counted before. So the more cases we have with less deaths, with less hospitalizations, the less severe it is, right? So even though we know this isn't technically a second wave, which I'll get to, it's a good thing that we're seeing increased cases with decreased hospitalizations and decreased deaths. It means it's not as deadly, okay? It's driving the IFR or the, I'm going to say this wrong. It's fatality, infection fatality rate, the deaths, right? If you die, fatality, it's driving it lower. So what they used to think was going to be like 2% or 1%, it's getting down into like the 0.2% now. Okay. So what that means is 99.9% of the people who get infected, who test positive, whether they have symptoms or not, are living. So why are we driving policies for something where 99.9% of the people get better? Okay. That's not the Spanish flu. That is so out of the realm of Spanish flu. So we've got increased testing for anyone and everyone, right? We're identifying more cases than ever, but our death rates are down, our hospitalizations are down. That's a good thing. That drives our fatality rate down, right? We know it's probably been around a lot longer than that. There's problems with the counting, right? So what I've heard is that certain places in Texas are doing what's called assumption-based counting. They get one positive test, they assume 16 other positive cases without testing. So you have to ask yourself, nothing in this world you can take for face value anymore. It's unfortunate, but it's the truth. Okay. So you have to dig deeper. You have to look behind the headlines. You have to read the articles, look at the graphs, read the statistics, understand it's not all about the case count. It should be about the death count. It should be about the hospitalizations, which is how this all started. We didn't want to overwhelm our hospitals, right? That makes sense. That's logical. I think everybody was on board with that. But now that that's not happening, that's why people are so angry. That's why there's so much pushback about this right now, because it's not logical. It doesn't make sense. We're using things to justify a means that isn't there. Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about with the herd immunity, that it makes sense to see this progressing the way it is and that it's a good thing. It's petering out, right? Before, everybody who got it was in the hospital. Now the people who getting it, some of them don't even have symptoms. I did antibody testing on my husband. He never had any symptoms. Per the testing, he had the more recent immune bodies, which mean he'd been exposed in a week before the lab draw, which was over a couple months ago already. None of us were sick. None of us had any symptoms. You know, I talked about my kid's common cold last week. Viruses are still out there. Just because the coronavirus is here doesn't mean the flu went away, doesn't mean pneumonia went away, doesn't mean the common cold went away. It just means that there was a lot of blurred lines with what was being diagnosed with what, and especially with the death counts, what was being considered. I tried to pick some of this apart on the CDC's website, which I just learned apparently has now been stripped of all of its data collecting privileges by the president this morning. Shocker. That they still had deaths as PIC, pneumonia, influenza, COVID, PIC. They still had them all grouped together. So that was like the only graph I could find was that. So they had the flu season on there, but then they continued to show this. So, you know, if somebody died with COVID, that's different than dying from COVID, right? If they had a stroke, but they tested positive for COVID, we know that it's the stroke that killed them. I know there's a lot of people making arguments about, well, if you are immune compromised and you get COVID, or you are already on dialysis, you know, you were susceptible to die from COVID because your body wasn't as healthy. And you can maybe make that argument, but what are you going to do for someone with a stroke or a heart attack? There was already a long process of ill health in that person happening long before an infection, whether they were symptomatic or not. So you have to understand not to panic when you hear these numbers or you hear the headline, you know, highest day of cases ever in Wisconsin. Yes, but lowest death count, lowest hospitalizations, and the percent testing positive is still not skyrocketing, right? It went up a little, again, because we're testing more people. It's okay. If it's passing around and it's mild or asymptomatic, it's no different than a common cold, right? And I get it. Oh, you're asymptomatic. You might give it to someone and they'll get really sick and die in the hospital. How is that any different than you walking around with the flu? You get the flu, you stay home for a couple days, you think you're better, you go back out in the world and you probably infect a dozen other people, maybe someone immune compromised. You have to understand, where does it end? Like, just ask the logical questions, you know, not the fear-based ones. So all of that said, that gives you a lot of background in so much as why we're seeing higher numbers. What are the numbers we should be looking at? You have to use critical thinking. You can't just do the shock value all the time, because you have to understand that's what news is. It's about shock value and sensationalizing things, because they have to capture your interest and hold your interest, and it's all about the ratings. If they start saying every day like, oh, the death count's lower, the death count's lower, the death count's lower, imagine how not seriously everybody would take it, right? We'd all go back to normal. But they're doing this for a purpose. And whatever that purpose is, everybody's got their own feelings on this. You can talk about personal freedoms. You can talk about the cloth coverings making things worse, right? Personally, I feel like it's something that's leading to, oh, it's just a mask. Then it's, oh, it's just a vaccine. Oh, then it's contact tracing. That's what they're seeming like they want to do, right? Because otherwise we'd be talking about immunity and taking vitamin D and taking zinc. You don't need a double-blind placebo-controlled study to tell somebody that taking vitamin D or taking zinc or cod liver oil or probiotics or eating a healthy diet is going to help them stay healthy, right? To be less severely affected by an infection. We don't need that. And if it was truly the health emergency that everyone wants it to be, then we would be doing that, right? If it was the Spanish flu and 1 out of 3 people around you was dropping dead, you would be doing everything possible, right? I mean, diet, supplements, like anything. But we just sit there and wait now, because what we're being told over and over on the news, what we're hearing a lot of people saying, and I know I heard it specifically out of one woman's mouth on NPR, a female doctor, she literally said, our only way out of this is a vaccine. Shame on her. We know that's not true. We know it's not true because the vaccine isn't saving us from the flu every year, is it? You only have a 36% chance, if you get the flu vaccine, of it being effective. And this virus is no different than the flu virus. I've said it 1,000 times. It's an RNA-based virus, a single strand, not double like DNA. A single strand, it mutates readily and willingly to continue to infect other hosts. That's why the flu vaccine changes every year. So even if we get something that's somewhat effective, and that's not even getting into the realm of safety, is it going to change every year? Are we going to go through this every year? Again, when does it end? Use your common sense. Use critical thinking. They tried to make a vaccine for Sars, which is a coronavirus. SARS and MERS are the same family of virus as coronavirus. They tried to make a SARS vaccine. It didn't work. It caused more harm than good in animal trials. They got the antibodies, but what happened is on wild reinfection, which means on wild exposure, re-exposure, when they had the vaccine and they got exposed again, it caused a systemic, huge, horrible inflammatory process that really damaged their lungs. So they stopped at animal trials. It wasn't safe, okay? So this is the stuff that people need to understand, because you're not getting it on the news, I'm not anti-mask. I'm not part of the problem. I'm trying to educate people. I'm trying to help you understand that taping a dirty Kleenex to your mouth, to your face, is not going to protect you from anything, okay? And that's what reusing a cloth mask is all the time. If you're not sanitizing it every day, if you're not wearing a proper mask, properly fitted, handled, disposed of, et cetera, it's not doing anything, okay? This whole, oh, it might help deal, all of the scientific literature that they're trying to say proves it's effective are for surgical masks or N95 masks in a clinical setting, in a controlled setting. The studies even say, I've read them. I don't read the headline. I read the whole study. Everything says the same thing. They're not translatable to cloth masks. They're not translatable to a community setting. All of this comes down to education. If people don't understand that, they're shaming and bullying other people and freaking out. I'm not saying I am the most healthy person, but I'm pretty darn healthy, okay? Yes, I have the occasional candy bar. Don't drink a lot of soda anymore these days. I try to avoid the sugar because it's my food intolerance. But in my house, when we get sick, we don't stay sick for weeks on ends. At least I don't. My kids don't. No, okay, you could argue my husband does. He has a lot of work stress though, and he doesn't always do what I tell him. When he gets sick, he should stay home and rest, but he doesn't. So his stuff drags on. My kids last week, fever, 24 hours, done. Second kid, less than 12 hours, done. Do they still have a little sniffly nose? Do they still have some drainage and coughing? Sure, it's a cold. It'll go away. It's fine. The point is, we're not knocked down, drag out sick for 10 or 14 days. So where was I going with all of this? You have to understand all of the sides of an argument, and that's what I'm hoping to bring, is some clarity and education to the entire topic, not to propose necessarily that you should or shouldn't wear one, but if you are going to understand which one you're wearing and why and what it's really doing. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about the mask. Now, what led me to all of this, again, was understanding the second wave and the cases and what does it really mean, okay? So we've talked about the fact that we know this was initially we wanted to spread out, slow down, right? Kick the can down the road in some terms of the spread, right? Now, okay, we're never going to stop it. We're never going to eradicate it. So you have to understand that first and foremost, because I think that's what's starting to happen in the news a lot is people they're under the assumption or the presumption that by doing these things, they're going to stop the virus. They're going to kill it. And that's not true. And a vaccine doesn't kill it either, right? It's not an antibiotic killing a bacteria. It just is something to trigger your body to have an immune response that protects you, allegedly, right, from getting symptoms, from getting really infected. So the problem is that it's not about flattening the curve anymore. It's now become this whole other ordeal where we want to stop it totally and completely, which is never going to happen. I'm sorry. It's just, that's nature. That's not even science. You don't have to argue about biology or virology or immunology. That's just nature. Like viruses and bacteria, like I shared a couple weeks ago from the book, The Body, there's millions and billions and trillions of them all around us all the time. And they've always been here and they're always going to be here. We need them to survive. They don't need us. So if we go around sanitizing everything, wiping everything off the face of the earth, we're going to be in a world of hurt. It's just that simple. We need them more than they need us. So let's see, where did I want to talk about this? So again, the headlines are starting to fill people's screens with dire warnings of this second wave. New regulations are being put into place, et cetera, et cetera. Point being, bottom line, it's not a second wave. The virus is on its last legs, and he has filled this post with graphs to prove everything that he's just said. And the only graph you need to see is the CDC's data over time of deaths. And here it is in the US. The trend line is unmistakable. So it kind of got cut off, and I know it's backwards in your screen, but as you can see, it went up and all it's doing is going down. So that's the most important one. Right? That's the one we should really be caring about, not the case count, especially if the hospitalizations aren't going up concurrently together. So if virologists were driving policy about COVID-19 rather than public health officials, we'd be more like Sweden right now. Sweden's health minister understood that the only chance to beat it was to get Swedish population to a herd immunity threshold as fast as they can. Okay, so let's talk about herd immunity threshold, or HIT, herd immunity threshold. What they've figured out is that the herd immunity threshold is between 10 to 20%. And this fact alone, he said, gets less press than any other, because if you actually understood the basic concepts of herd immunity and the math behind it, we wouldn't have been as fearful and done all this speculative stuff in the beginning, where they said they thought the herd immunity was going to be like 70%. So obviously the difference between a herd immunity threshold, or a HIT, of 70% and one of 10 to 20% is dramatic, right? So the lower the HIT, the quicker a virus will burn out as it loses the ability to infect more people, which is exactly what COVID-19 is doing everywhere, including the US, which is why the death curve looks the way it looks. Okay? So, again, the more time we give the virus to spread, the more time it has to mutate and become something else, become something worse, become like the Spanish flu, where there truly was a second wave that went through and wiped out a completely different population, okay? So, scientists from Oxford, Virginia Tech, and Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine all recently explained the hit of COVID-19 in this paper, and this is a quote. "We searched the literature for estimates of individual variation in propensity to acquire or transmit COVID-19 or other infectious diseases and overlaid the findings as vertical lines. Most CV estimates are compromised between 2 and 4, a range where naturally acquired immunity to SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus, may place populations over the herd immunity threshold once as few as 10 to 20% of its individuals are immune." Now, calculations from this study of data in Stockholm showed that a hit of 17% a hit of 17%. And there's a paper, and I encourage you to go find this stuff and read it, by Brown professor Dr. Andrew Bostom, titled COVID-19 Herd Immunity Without Vaccination, Teaching Modern Vaccine Dogma Old Tricks. And here's a quote that's a summary. Okay, so once again, naturally acquired herd immunity to COVID-19 combined with earnest protection of the vulnerable elderly, especially nursing homes and assisted living facilities, is an eminently reasonable and practical alternative to the dubious panacea of mass compulsory vaccination against this virus. This strategy was successfully implemented in Malmö, Sweden, which had few COVID-19 deaths by assiduously protecting its elder care homes while schools remained open, residents carried on in bars and cafes, and the doors of hairdressers and gyms were open throughout. One of the most vocal members of the scientific community discussing COVID-19's herd immunity threshold is Stanford's Nobel Laureate, Dr. Michael Levitt. So get this. This is where I got interested, okay? Back on May 4th, he gave a really great interview to the Stanford Daily where he was one who advocated for Sweden's approach of letting it spread naturally until you arrived at herd immunity threshold, again, with protecting elderly, okay, or those compromised. He was quoted as saying, "If Sweden stops at about 5,000 or 6,000 deaths, we will know that they've reached herd immunity and we didn't need to do any kind of lockdown. My own feeling is that it will probably stop because of herd immunity. COVID is serious. It's at least a serious flu, but it's not going to destroy humanity as people thought." Guess what? That's exactly what happened. As of today, 7 weeks after his prediction, Sweden has 5,280 deaths. And he provides a graph that says you can see the deaths in Sweden peaked when the hit was halfway to its peak, roughly 7.3%, and by the time the virus hit 14%, it was nearly extinguished. So it's kind of hard to see, but this is the graph he shows, okay? Now, how could Dr. Levitt have predicted the death range for Sweden so accurately over 7 weeks ago? Because he had a solid idea of what the herd immunity threshold would be. He said if you want to further geek out, you can read on why herd immunity to COVID-19 is reached much earlier than thought. There's a link to that article within this article. So he said, you can watch this video from Dr. Levitt, and he goes on and on about all of these things, about the technicalities behind it. By the way, as a quick aside, something else the press won't touch is that COVID-19 is coronavirus, and we have all been exposed to many coronaviruses during our lives on Earth, like the common cold. Guess what? Scientists are now showing evidence that up to 81% of us can mount a strong response to COVID-19 without ever having been exposed to it before. Cross-reactive SARS-CoV-2 T-cell epitopes revealed pre-existing T-cell responses in 81% of unexposed individuals, and validation of similarity to common cold human coronaviruses provided a functional basis for postulated heterologous immunity. All right, that was a big mouthful. What that means is if your immune system is strong enough and you've been exposed to any kind of coronaviruses before, you could potentially have enough immunity against them that it wouldn't even trigger your antibodies, right? Wouldn't even trigger symptoms. So I think this really explains why when I did the antibody testing on my husband and myself, he had IgM antibodies present, meaning a recent exposure, and I had none. If he was exposed, wouldn't I be exposed? Why does he have antibodies and I don't? Because antibodies are actually a very deep-seated part of your immune system. It's like you've got your skin, right? All of this, like the barriers on the outside, and then you've got like second level protectors and third level protectors, and you get down in there and you get antibodies, right? So you have to actually get the infection to mount the immune response in your body to create antibodies. So what if it doesn't even get that far? There you go. There's your explanation for why asymptomatic spread is so unusual. This alone could explain why the herd immunity threshold is so much lower for COVID-19 than some scientists originally thought. when the number being talked about was closer to 70% to begin with. So many of us have already been immune. And if that's not enough for you, a similar study from Sweden was just released that shows roughly twice as many people have developed T-cell immunity compared with those who we can detect antibodies in. That's exactly what happened to us, I think. My T-cells were strong enough. My antibodies never got involved. My husband's did. He's a lot more stressed out than I am. So, let's see. What else? To death rate over time. So he talks a little bit more about the death rate. I want to make sure. So we actually, he wants to talk about the death rate. Okay. In New York City. So what he's saying is that the reason the rates were so bad in New York is that they locked down so late, they didn't actually flatten anything. They had the highest population density in the US, and the public health officials and governors there made the boneheaded decision to send COVID positive nursing home residents back to their nursing homes, accelerating deaths of the most vulnerable. So what's their death curve look like today? In this case, he borrowed the graph from the New York City Public Health website, and here it is. Down, right? So, the reason the deaths from COVID-19 are dwindling down to nothing isn't because Governor Cuomo is a policy genius. In fact, he likely created more unnecessary deaths than any other governor with the nursing home decision. It is because the virus, like every virus in the history of mankind, is running out of people to infect. The virus has hit its herd immunity threshold of 10 to 20%, and 70% of people are likely naturally immune. So hosts are now in short supply. That's simply what viruses do. That's nature for you, right? He talks about what New York's hit looks like today, their infection fatality rate. In a previous article, he went into much detail about the infection fatality rate, which I think we already kind of covered, right? We understand that the more cases that we test positive for, but the lower the hospitalizations and death rates go, that's a good thing because it drives down the infection fatality rate. So he just wanted to lay out one more quote to remind people that the infection fatality rate is the probability of dying for a person who is actually infected. It is one of the most critical and most contested features of the disease thus far. It's not a disease, infection. The expected total mortality burden is directly rated to the IFR. So, 7 of the 12 original IFRs were in the range of 0.07 to 0.2, which are similar to the values of the seasonal influenza. 3 values were modestly higher, and 2 are modestly lower. So people are continuing to do studies to try to figure this out, right? The data, though, on the IFR has now been replicated so many times that our own Centers for Disease Control announced that their best estimate showed an IFR below 0.3%. And I've heard that now is 0.26% even. The best estimate scenario also assumes that 35% of infections are asymptomatic, meaning the total number of infections is more than 50% larger than the number of symptomatic cases. It therefore implies that the IFR is between 0.2% and 0.3%. By contrast, the projections that the CDC made in March, which predicted as many as 1.7 million people would die without intervention, this assumed an IFR of 0.8%. So we went from 0.8 down to 0.26, basically. Okay? So, in order to be as bulletproof as possible, and because the IFR is an important part of the math, he's picked a simple and defensible number, also 0.26, to work with going forward. So what he did was he took this number, right? And he's saying, okay, yes, certain states are having an uptake in 3 measurements. The COVID-19 tests administered, positive tests, and in some cases, hospitalizations. Now, that's not the case here in Wisconsin. Not saying that that's true everywhere, right? We just heard that in New Mexico, they're getting overwhelmed. However, all 3 of these measurements are dubious. Hopefully, some of the rise in cases is real because then the U.S. will have arrived at herd immunity threshold sooner. This has been delayed slightly by lockdowns. And we know this based on the death curve in the U.S., which we are very close to being done with. So, all right, now he's saying, come on, stay with me here. We know this is math. This is the good part. This is basic math, and it's going to give us the most important but very crude number we need to understand to understand that the second wave is nonsense, okay? The approximate herd immunity threshold already attained by state and by the United States. He's figured this out. If you know how many people have died from COVID-19 in any one region, you can quickly calculate how many people have had COVID-19 in that same region. All you do is divide deaths by the IFR. So let's use New York as the example. As of today, there have been 31,137 deaths from COVID-19. You take that divided by 0.0026, you get almost 12 million. I'm not going to read that big number out. Okay? You take those 11, he rounded down, 11 million people divided by New York's population of 19.45 million, and you get a hit of 65%. Now, clearly this is overstated because the total deaths derives hit, and since New York has had a higher rate of nursing home deaths, all these numbers drive this number higher. So he says, huge disclaimer, we understand this math is crude, but it's also directionally accurate on the comparisons between states and helps explain what's going on. So now that we understand that the herd immunity threshold to snuff out the virus, which means to not give it any more hosts to infect, is around 17%, we can figure each state out, right? So look at this table he created using the math above. So Florida, population, almost 22 million. COVID deaths, using the IFR, he gets the number of infected population. Their implied hit at the time was 6%. They're not to 17% yet. They've got to get to 17%, and then this peters out. So do you see why it's not a second wave? It's just continuing its natural course until it achieves its threshold. Texas, another good example. Population, 29 million. COVID deaths, 2,400. Using the IFR, he calculates the infected population, 925,000. The implied hit is only 3%. 3% is a far way away from 17%, which is why Texas needs to stop assuming cases and give us real numbers so that we know when they actually hit their herd immunity threshold. Arizona, same thing. 7.3 million. COVID deaths, 1,600. Using the IFR, infected population is over 600,000, meaning that their implied herd immunity threshold is currently at 8%. They're not there yet either. Guess what? New Jersey, New York, they're up in the 60s because of all the deaths they cause with the elderly. But overall, the U.S. as a whole, 328 million people. COVID deaths, 128,000. Using the IFR gives an infected population of 50,000. The implied hit is 15%. So on average, when you average out the entire US, we are very, very close to being done with this. That's the point. Unless we give it more time to mutate, it becomes something new, and we start all over again. Okay? So he says, notice anything. New York is well past herd immunity. The southern states in the news now are below herd immunity. While the US overall is nearly there, this is why the death curve overall from the CDC looks the way it does, because we're almost basically done with this virus. So he added on here a quick update. Mount Sinai doctors just released a study showing a seroprevalence study, which is, I believe that's the antibody testing, a sample of a random 5,000 New Yorkers, and by the week ending April 19th, the seroprevalence in the screening group reached 19.3%, which means that's higher than the hit of 17%. So 19.3% people already showed antibodies. And consider what we just learned from Sweden, that half of the people with immunity won't even show it in this test because their T cells and their immune system and their other barriers to infection are stronger. Then we know that it's entirely plausible that New York is well past 40% or more people, which starts to look closer to the 65% number that his crude math got him to. Either way, keep it simple. New York, and especially New York City, are well past their herd immunity threshold, which explains why their death curve continues on the downward slope. Now, he goes into some details about Florida. Let's see here. There was something about Florida because it was the current whipping boy of the press. They also have great data, though, despite the fact no one seems to be listening to the governor, the health department, or the hospitals in Florida, who all seem to be saying the same thing, which is basically that everything is fine. This is on June 20th. Their Department of Health produced a presentation that explained how their testing had changed over time. So again, this is what I was explaining at the beginning. In February and early March, you only got tested if you were symptomatic and had traveled to China, right? Or another international location. Beginning mid-March through April, they tested you if you were 65 years of older and symptomatic, regardless of travel history. The age limit gradually lowered as April wore on. By May, when things reopened, you got tested regardless of age or symptoms. So do you see how it's changed? Like if we had been testing everyone every day from the beginning, you'd have totally different numbers. You'd have a totally different outlook on that. So that's where I'm saying the clarity behind this, understanding the numbers and where they're derived from, it matters, okay? Can't take things for point blank. All right, so as the state reopened, they began to test everyone regardless of age of symptoms. What do you think happened? Obviously, more positives. So here's his first fact. Number one, all of the second wave states have dramatically increased their testing. This alone could cause cases to rise and is probably the single biggest reason they have. Okay, he provides another chart showing that. It's overladen with the time and as testing increased. It can be quite that simple. Cases can be up because of more testing. However, cases have never ever been a reliable indicator of anything. Whereas hospitalizations have been a reliable indicator, right? Because just because someone tests positive doesn't mean it's overwhelming our hospital. It doesn't mean they're going to die. We're looking at a 99.9% recovery rate, okay? So, there was an uptick in hospitalizations beginning around June 6th in Florida. The most obvious reason the hospitalizations went up is because of what's happening in the hospital system. Patients overall are returning to hospitals for elective surgery, as were all that were delayed during lockdown. So again, even if the hospitalization numbers have a slight uptick, it might not just be because of COVID. It might be because of everyone else coming back to the hospital for other things that weren't allowed before. Further, anyone that comes in for any kind of elective surgery or procedure previously delayed, every one of those patients is screened. So any patient who's undergoing an elective knee surgery and tests positive for COVID-19, even though they're asymptomatic, will be classified as hospitalized with COVID-19. So there you go again, just like with the death stuff, right? So, here was a quote from the New York Times. 1/3 of all patients admitted to the city, Miami's main public hospital over the past 2 weeks after going to the emergency room for car crash injuries and other urgent problems tested positive for coronavirus. Okay, so you start looking for it, you'll find it. I dislike Trump. I don't like him as a person. But there is some truth in what he's saying, though it's not articulated well. If you look for it, you will find it. If you stop testing, it doesn't mean the cases go away, but the numbers go away, right? I mean, it's kind of an illogical way to get at it, but this is the point, right? People are showing up in the emergency room from a car crash and then testing positive and being considered hospitalized for COVID. That's not the same. That doesn't make sense. That's not a logical way to look at this. Fact number 2, hospitalizations are up slightly because of how positive patients are being tracked. They will be in the number even if they didn't go to the hospital because of COVID-19. So again, there's still something else going on. It's not just more tests and the way hospitalizations are happening, but many states reopened on May 1st and all their trend lines were flat to down for weeks. It's as if some super spreader event happened in certain states towards late May, early June. It's really clear that something unique is going on if you look at data from Minnesota, the state where George Floyd was tragically murdered, where positive cases are stratified by age. So again, when you look at the graph he has for Minnesota, right? Hard to read. These are all the age groups. Whoops, there's 20 to 29. Guess there was a spike because of the protests. So as you can see in Minnesota, the percent of positive cases by people aged 20 to 29 really spiked in mid to late June, which means infections likely happened in early June or late May. So yes, obviously the densely packed protests for racial equality and social justice, which we all personally applaud, appear to have caused a uptake in cases in hospitals. See this article, Houston protesters. It was an article about Houston and the protests and the coronavirus there. So similar thing. Okay. So, fact number 3, a real rise in both cases and hospitalizations does perfectly match the timing of the nationwide protests, which include many densely packed crowds together for many hours and even days. So he's got some more graphs here. U.S. social interaction score versus COVID hospital census. However, the good news about all of this is there has been no impact on the number of COVID-19 patients in the ICU. Okay, that's the important one, which is consistent with the fact that we know younger patients are less impacted, meaning they're having more mild cases. Okay. Fact number 4, despite a small uptick in hospitalizations, the number of COVID-19 patients in the ICU continues to decline. It's not deaths, it's cases, right? You've been hearing about a handful of states with rising cases. Well, he had some more graphs here, but for those states, what about deaths? They appear to be going the other way, which is exactly what we talked about at the beginning of this. So he said, finally, and perhaps the most important slide using Florida as the example, is there is no correlation between more tests, more positive tests, and deaths. Okay. The fact that these 3 measures are not linear means Florida has a low and stable death rate, and the recent uptick in positive cases, which happens to be perfectly timed with protests, means nothing. How many more facts does he have here? What are we on? Number 5, there is no correlation in Florida. The state's taking the most heat in the press about a second wave between positive tests and deaths. I think we've covered that enough. And then a final thought about Florida, which was really good. This was an op-ed. I found the actual newspaper and article. John Thomas Littell, MD, is a family physician in Florida. This is kind of a long quote. Actually, I'm not even going to read it. It's 3 pages long. Never mind, it's not a long quote. It's the whole thing. But I encourage you guys to read it because it is a lot of common sense, which is what I keep trying to emphasize to people, to get clarity about this, to bring you peace of mind, to understand that it doesn't have to be so fear-based, right? To look at the right numbers the right way. So just a little bit of it, though, like I said, it's worth reading his whole op-ed, but it does span 3.5 pages, so I don't want to just sit here and read that. But what he said is, several times a day on every possible news outlet, we are bombarded with updates as to the new number of cases of COVID-19 in the US and elsewhere. News analysts then use these numbers to justify criticisms of those who dare to reject the CDC's recommendation with regards to mask wearing and social distancing. It is imperative that all Americans, and especially those in the medical profession, understand the actual definition of a case of COVID-19 so as to make informed decision as to how we live our lives. Older Americans remember all too well and the dread they experienced when a family member was diagnosed with a case of scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, or polio. During his career in family medicine, including several years as an Army physician, he cared for patients with chickenpox, shingles, Lyme disease, as well as measles, tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS. The case definition established for these diseases by the CDC requires the presence of signs and symptoms of that disease. In other words, each case involves a sick patient. Laboratory studies may be performed to confirm a diagnosis, but are not sufficient in the absence of clinical symptoms. Having now been privileged to care for sick patients with COVID, both in and out of the hospital, I'm happy to see the number of these sick patients dwindle, almost to 0 in my community, while the case numbers continue to go up. Why is that? In marked contrast to measles, shingles, and other infectious disease cases of COVID-19, okay, let me back up. And other infectious diseases, cases of COVID-19 do not require the presence of any symptoms whatsoever. Health departments are encouraging everyone and anyone to come in for testing, and each positive test is reported as yet another new case. Okay, so he goes on to talk a lot more about the testing. He mentions here anyone who has a positive PCR test or serological test, antibody test, they're now counting those as cases even though they were previously infected. So again, if you want to talk about cumulative cases, I can get on board with that if we want to understand how many people total were at some point infected over the course of this. But if you're talking about cases now of people actively sick and spreading, you can't use that case number because they're not sick right now. They're not infecting anybody. They've had it already. They're not infecting anyone. He talks about the issues with the lab tests, that currently it is important to understand that the presence of lab testing is not the only criterion that the CDC uses to establish diagnosis. They can only have the presence of 1 or 2 flu-like symptoms: fever, chills, cough, sore throat, or shortness of breath. In the absence of another proven cause, like the flu, it's still sufficient to give a diagnosis of COVID-19 as long as the patient also meets certain epidemiological linkage criteria. Meaning they're clinically compatible with symptoms, they've had an exposure, they've traveled, had close contact, been around a person diagnosed, etc., etc. So, he goes on, but it's a really, really well articulated article, op-ed that he wrote. And again, his name was Dr. John Thomas Littell, Ittell. He's a medical doctor in Florida. One other thing he says, now perhaps you see why the increasing number of cases and even deaths due to COVID-19 is fraught with misinterpretation and is not in any way a measure of the actual morbidity and mortality. My patients who insist upon wearing masks, gloves, and social distancing are citing these misleading statistics as justifications for their decisions, and of course that they are simply following the CDC guidelines. I simply advise them that COVID-19 is not in the atmosphere around us. It resides in the respiratory tracts of infected individuals and can only be transmitted to others by sick, infected persons after prolonged contact with others. So he says, you may ask, why are we continuing to report increasing numbers of cases as though it were bad news for America rather than good news? i.e. that the thousands of healthy Americans testing positive are most often asymptomatic. This is indicative of the presence of herd immunity, protecting themselves and many of us from potential future assaults by variants of COVID. Why did we, as a society, stop sending our children to schools, camps, and sports? Why did we stop going to work in church and public parks and beaches? Why did we insist healthy persons stay at home rather than observing the evidence-based, medically prudent method of identifying those who were sick and isolating them from the rest of the population, advising the sick to stay home and allowing the rest of society to function normally? All while we witnessed gatherings of protesters in recent days with little concerns for the spread among any of these asymptomatic persons. Most certainly many are hoping that the increasing case numbers will discourage folks from coming to any more rallies. Fear is a powerful weapon. FDR famously broadcast to Americans in 1933 that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. He would argue that we have to fear those who would have us remain fearful and servile and willing to surrender basic freedoms without justification. He is a board-certified family physician. He earned his MD from George Washington University, served in the U.S. Army, received Meritorious Service Medal, also served with the National Health Service Corps in Montana, and in his 18 years in Kissimmee, Florida, he had served on the faculty of the UCF School of Medicine, president of the County Medical Society, chief of staff of Florida Hospital, currently resides in Kissimmee and Ocala. So, as the author of this article says, Dr. Littell brings up many more issues than he's chosen to address in the post because he already wrote about them before. So, again, we're not overwhelming our hospitals. We need to understand what herd immunity is, because if we understand herd immunity and we do the math, we know we've got just a little bit more to go, and that realistically, we're not going to stop it or kill it. It just needs to run its course. And that if this pattern holds true as is held true for every other virus in our history, in theory, hopefully, it doesn't have time to mutate, and when we're done with it, just like Sars. So that is all for today. Please share this with people, because I don't think people understand herd immunity well enough to comprehend that what we're experiencing right now in increased case numbers is not a bad thing unless there is a subsequent correlation of hospitalizations in ICU and deaths, and that's not happening. So we're seeing the natural course of a virus now going through mild and asymptomatic hosts, going through people who are mild or asymptomatic hosts, and we're reaching a herd immunity. And we know about T-cell immunity, so you may have, already been exposed. And, if you do the antibody testing and it comes back negative, you don't have to be like, oh, bummer, I didn't have it. Oh, and now I'm still at risk. Maybe not. Look at me. My husband had antibodies and I didn't. So obviously my T-cells are rock stars. So anyways, again, I think this is the kind of information that should be shared on the news. This is real news. This would help give people peace of mind and understand that we don't need to be making really broad, all-encompassing policies that we have, no real evidence behind in an attempt to control something that is just not going to be controlled, clearly. So please share, and hopefully next week I'll finally have time to play with the EMF meter reader, and some of this will have calmed down so that I don't have to talk about coronavirus again. Hopefully it starts to reach herd immunity and we see further decreases in other states, and people can start to get back to normal and regain their common sense, logical, critical thinking, okay? Look deeper, look at other numbers, look at the whole story, read the whole article, read the scientific study. Don't just read the headline. I don't think people are taking enough time, just like with your health, to take enough time and responsibility for your own health, right? Like going to the doctor, medical doctor, getting a pill, right? Versus being responsible every day, day in, day out for your diet and your lifestyle choices, right? So if you want to talk about being healthy, that's a whole other discussion, right? Health is not in a pill. So thank you for joining me today, and I will see you all next week. Have a great afternoon.